Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me once again today, and welcome to a slightly different Dominions 5 strategy video. This is a video that was requested by Pendragon9123. Thanks for your support of the channel, man, and he wanted to know a little bit in more detail about using blood, specifically using blood in combat, but I'm gonna branch out a little bit from that. We're going to talk about using blood as a primary path or a main path, or what it is that blood does for you. Now, strategically, the thing about blood is that blood slaves are really easy to get. Blood hunters acquire several blood slaves a turn if they're properly set up, and so your blood income can easily be 3, 4, 5, 10 times higher than your income of any other type of gem, which means that even though every blood spell almost costs blood slaves, and often a lot of them, if you look at the rituals, you can see the blood slave costs are way higher than the costs in gems for summons and other paths. Even so, blood spells are actually quite cheap in terms of the quote-unquote gems that they use, because blood slaves just aren't valuable compared to gems. So for example, Bind Fiery Imps. You can look at this spell. This spell was actually nerfed just in the last patch. It went from 2 slaves to 6. It gives you 5 Fiery Imps. Fiery Imps are pretty shitty units, to be honest. They have few hit points, low protection. They have decent attack and defense skills. However, they have this armor-piercing fire attack, where they throw flames. They only do 5 AP damage, but if you buff their strength, of course, they do strength minus 3 damage, so if you buff Fiery Imp's strength, it goes up. You can push them up to strength 12 very easily, in which case they're basically throwing low-quality crossbow bolts. They only have a few each. That said, at 2 blood slaves with full scaling, this spell was notably underpriced. Just because 2 blood slaves is the equivalent of, like, I don't know, half a gem. Like 1 fire gem, something like that. So at 6, you could call this the equivalent of maybe 2 gems or something, and for 2 gems, this is a fine summon. This is perfectly good. They're small and weak, but they have this armor-piercing missile that they can throw, and they can contribute to the battle, so, you know, bully for them. In any case, that's the thing you have to keep in mind about blood. The math of blood hunting is very much in favor of massing a ton of blood slaves very quickly. A Blood 1 blood hunter carrying a Sanguine Dowsing Rod, which is a construction 4 item that costs 5 blood slaves, will succeed at hunting 90% of the time, depending on the population of the province. It has to be over 5,000 for optimal chances, and the unrest level of the province, it should be 0, because once again, it can give you a failure chance, albeit a very small one. And if they succeed, they find it's 1d6 plus 1 blood slaves, but the d6 is open-ended, like every other Dominion's d6. If it rolls a 6, it reduces to 5, and then rolls again, and adds the total. So, generally speaking, you can expect a Blood 1 blood hunter with a Sanguine Dowsing Rod to bring you in about 4 blood slaves a turn. Now just think about that for a second. If any other path had a way for a level 1 mage to generate 4 gems per turn, it would be crazy. Hell, if a level 1 mage could generate even 1 gem or 2 gems per turn reliably, that would be game-changing. Incredibly game-changing. And in fact, that capability used to exist in the form of permanent gem-generating items like the Clam of Pearls and such back in Dominions 3, and it was so oppressive, it became so mandatory for you to have as many of those things as you possibly could, that Illimantor actually removed it from the game. The Clam of Pearls is now a temporary gem-gen item as opposed to a permanent gem-gen item, which was good. I think was good for the game. It changed the meta in a very positive way. But that mechanism still exists for blood. In fact, it's integral to how blood works. So, when it comes to using blood as a primary path, there's a big distinction to draw, and that is the distinction between the generic blood spells, many of which are powerful, but which are not as game-defining, and the national blood spells. There are a number of nations that have national blood spells, national summons and such, that are completely game-defining for how they play. In particular, Lanka and the monkey nations following Lanka, and Mictlan and Xibalba have this quality. There are 2 kind of sets of national blood summons that very much alter how you play. But first, let's look at combat spells. I'm looking at all the combat spells that are in the blood school. The first thing you notice is that there aren't actually all that many. If you compare to, like, Evocation. Evocation has a lot of combat spells from many different paths. Thaumaturgy even has a lot of combat spells. So does Enchantment. All of them have, more than a solid line of spells here. Thaumaturgy, Enchantment. Hell, Conjuration has a lot of generic Well, a lot of those are actually effects. For some reason, Conjuration 0 is used as the code in the mod inspector for a lot of various effects, but Conjuration has about as many as Blood, perhaps a little bit more. Alteration has a ton of combat spells. Blood has relatively few. Blood combat spells are neither the most powerful nor the most common, but there are some very significant effects here. I don't know why that turned into Blood Burst. Let's try... Okay, that fixed it. Good. Sometimes those little display glitches crop up. So, in combat, as a Blood Mage, the most important thing to keep in mind is that Blood is a communion path. You have Sabbath Slave and Sabbath Master. They cost Blood Slaves, but that's a fairly negligible cost. More importantly, they give you 100 fatigue. So Blood Communions, Blood Sabbaths, start off with your slaves being at a pretty high fatigue level, which sounds like it should be crippling compared to Astral Communions, but it's not, because Blood also has the spell Reinvigoration. Reinvigoration is an incredible spell. Reinvigoration removes 200 fatigue, which is the maximum amount of fatigue you can actually have from the mage casting it. And it's a personal buff, area of effect caster, which means it affects all the slaves in a communion that this caster is involved in. So very often what you'll see is a Sabbath, a Blood Communion, will cast Reinvigoration like once or twice during its script and at the end. So you'll have a mage whose job is to sit there, cast Reinvigoration round 2 to kill off the 100 fatigue that came from starting the Sabbath, and cast it round 5 to kill off the fatigue that you've built up from casting your early high-level buffs, which you're doing in the Sabbath. The net effect of this, because remember, you can only script spells in the first 5 rounds, so in the first 5 rounds is the only time when mages will generally cast very high fatigue, very powerful spells, battle enchantments, army-wide buffs, that kind of thing. And normally you can't cast those in communions, because if you do, you'll build up a ton of fatigue very early, and then your mages will fatigue out and die during their off-script casting if the battle drags on. Sabbaths don't have this problem nearly so much, because a Sabbath can rack up a ton of fatigue in the first 3 rounds, cast Reinvigoration, get rid of it all, and then when their mages go off script, they will tend to spam relatively low-level spells. So as long as you've set the Sabbath up with something of an eye towards making sure that you have the same paths, your Sabbath slaves are less likely to die. Also, it helps that, famously, a number of the nations that make heavy use of Blood Sabbaths also are Turbo Communion nations. So, for example, the Niflheim line of nations, which are all Blood nations, and they all have Scrati, which are fantastic communion slaves, possibly the best in the game. Lanka. Lanka has giant Blood communion slaves, and they have nature mages that tie into those Sabbaths. So they can cast Regeneration on themselves very easily and get at least a little bit of Turbo Communion potential. It's like 2 or 3... actually, they can enlarge themselves too, so I think they can get up to 3 or 4 HP regen per turn without too much trouble, without straining too hard. But so Reinvigoration, as I said, basically enables you to cast some high fatigue buffs early on, and then wipe that penalty away so that you can kind of start over with a clean slate. And this is useful because a lot of Blood spells have high fatigue costs, because of course every gem, slaves count as gems for this purpose, and every gem comes with a mandatory cost of 100 fatigue. So if you have a spell that costs 4 Blood Slaves, it will give you 400 fatigue, even though those Blood Slaves aren't as valuable as gems are. So when it comes to combat with Blood Mages, at relatively low levels, the important thing that you do is lay down battlefield-wide spells or wide AoE spells, of which Blood has a few that are interesting. So most of the actual Blood combat spells, not super impressive. Bleed is kind of a specialty anti-thug spell. It is magic resistance negatable. If it hits, it will likely kill a thug if it passes their magic resistance check, because it gives them profuse bleeding. And profuse bleeding just means you take armor negating damage every round until you pass a check to stop it, and the check is really hard. Blood Boil, not terribly effective. It is point armor negating damage, but it has a short range, it has a high fatigue cost, it requires Blood Fire crosspaths, which aren't super common. This is something that Garnet Sorceresses can do for you if you have them, but it's just not very efficient. Agony is actually a pretty effective early combat spell, and if you have Blood 2 mages, I wouldn't necessarily form a Sabbath just for this purpose, if I had any other choice, but if you have Blood 2 mages, Agony is pretty decent, because with Agony you can spend 2 slaves, because you are Blood 2, so you can cut it down to 50 fatigue. And Agony does a pretty significant amount of armor negating damage in a good AoE, so it's 1 armor negating damage. It is magic resistance negatable, but it's an AoE of at least 4 and more likely 6 or 8 if you are in a Sabbath. It does damage, and it also causes fear. And the fear, interestingly, I believe is actually separate from the damage. So even if you don't take any damage, it can still cause fear. So if you spam Agony on an enemy early game army that is attacking you, it will both lower their morale and hurt them. If it's human troops, you're very likely to kill some of them before they arrive, or at least lower their hit points so that your troops can beat them up. And then, since their morale is lowered, they're likely to rout much earlier than the enemy might anticipate. So Agony, pretty solid combat spell. It's low level. If you have very powerful blood mages, they can spam the hell out of Agony over a very wide AoE for fairly cheap. Or you can form a small communion. If you have, blood 1 mages and you have 2 or 3 slaves, or let's say 4. Let's say you have 4 blood 1 slaves and 4 blood 1 masters. You've pushed them up to blood 3, so already it's 50 fatigue. They can spend extra slaves to cast it, so they can cut it down to, into the 20s or 30s at least. Spread that out among the 4 slaves, and then of course, since you have blood 2 to cast Agony, you also have blood 1, which means you can reinvigorate very easily, and you're very unlikely to lose that Sabbath unless you actually lose the battle. Beyond that, general purpose in-combat spells are, as I said, generally buffs. So Bloodlust buffs your demons, and specifically it's the standard strength buff for demons. It's +4 strength. It's just like Strength of Giants, but it is battlefield-wide and affects your demon summons. So, if you are a powerful Blood Nation who's using a lot of demon summons, then Bloodlust is an amazing spell because it is a much cheaper version of Strength of Giants that hits everyone. And that's fantastic. That's a really, really good spell. The other damage spells, like Hellfire, not super impressive. If you have Blood-Fire crosspaths, which are, as I said, not that common, you can get some armor-piercing damage over a pretty wide AoE, but you can't spam it very much, because, once again, high fatigue costs slaves. Call Lesser Horror, once again, a little risky. The Horrors will tend to attack whoever they want, and Blood Astral is a very uncommon crosspath. If you are Abyssia and you have Blood Astral Warlocks, it can be useful to throw some Astral Geysers into the middle of the enemy army, thus horror marking them, and then spam Call Lesser Horror. That can tie them up quite effectively, because Lesser Horrors are in fact kind of tricky for standard troops to deal with. But generally speaking, this isn't a relevant spell, because outside of Abyssia, this is a fairly uncommon crosspath. I think Utgard and the Niflheim line can get it on randoms. The most notable use of blood in combat, however, is countering thugs and supercombatants. You start off with Bleed. Bleed counters thugs who haven't stacked magic resistance, because it lets you just kill them automatically with armor negating damage. Oh, sorry, pardon the discontinuity there. Okay, where was I? Combat spells. The main damage spell in Blood actually comes at Blood 5, and that's Bloodletting. Bloodletting just does drain life, armor negating damage to literally everything on the field. This has some real upsides and some real downsides. The upsides are, this is a very, very good spell for interrupting other people's casting. When you cast Bloodletting, everybody on the field has to make a magic resistance check to avoid a hit, and if you can get that hit off rapidly, it has casting time 250%, so it'll launch at 125%, which is just after the first round of spells has gone off. If you can get that off real quick while they're in the middle of casting, say, a long buff of some kind, like, I'm trying to remember what has 300% cast time. There's some buffs that it will just interrupt, or if the enemy is trying to communion, they'll cast their Communion Master, Communion Slave spells, and then they'll get hit by Bloodletting. While it should be just after they've started to cast their second spell that they'll get hit by Bloodletting, which can be very useful because, of course, if a mage takes damage, they stop trying to cast, or they have to make a check to avoid stopping casting. The downside, of course, is it hits all your own troops, too. So if you're casting Bloodletting, you have to make sure that your mages are boosted with magic resistance gear. You have to make sure your troops are tough so they don't care very much about the damage, and you have to resign yourself to losing Blood Slaves, because Blood Slaves, of course, are units on the field. That's an important tactical consideration for Blood Nations, because it means they're vulnerable to damage effects. You know, if somebody casts Earthquake, your Blood Slaves are going to die, because their defense score is very low. In fact, let me pull that unit up. That's a Blood Slave, right there. Defense skill 6, no protection, 9 hit points. And if they die, they die. They're gone. You can't spend them if they're dead. So, anything that can drop a lot of battlefield-wide damage, like Rain of Stones, is a good counter to blood magic that you have to be aware of. Acid or Firestorm can be a good counter to blood magic. In fact, if you're Abyssia, you also have to be careful that the heat aura of your warlocks doesn't set your blood slaves on fire, which is hilarious, don't get me wrong. It's incredibly funny, but it also means that you have trouble actually casting spells unless you position blood slaves carefully. Plus side, you can use blood slaves from a very long way away, actually, a surprisingly long way away. So you can set your blood slaves, you can actually give them to other commanders and have them standing kind of vaguely near your blood mages, so that if anything targets your blood mages, or if your blood mages have a damaging aura, they won't necessarily kill off your slaves. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. In terms of damage, like I said, the AoE damage of blood is not terribly impressive. Most impressive is the point damage and anti-thug abilities. So bleed, profuse bleeding outright kills most thugs if it hits. Leech, range 30, so range long enough to be useful, especially if you took a longer range bless. 25 armor negating, life draining damage right off the bat. No save, nothing, just take 25 damage. This is one of the spells that kills supercombatants very, very well because there's no way to stop it. It's not resistible by anything. It's castable by any Blood 1 mage. Temper Flesh does nothing to it. Armor, defense score, nothing. Nothing stops Leech. And similarly, nothing stops its big brother, Life for a Life. Life for a Life has infinite range. This is effectively Blood Soul Slay. It's a lot more expensive, but it does 40 plus 5 per level armor negating damage. It just kills people outright. This is one of the easiest counters to supercombatants. If you have a supercombatant and you're fighting a blood nation, if you reach the late game, which is when supercombatants really start to come online, you have to walk onto the field expecting to be targeted by Life for a Life. And Life for a Life absolutely will kill you. Even if you're Phlegred, you have Laestrygonian Tyrants kitted up with every trick in the book, what's going to happen is your Laestrygonian Tyrant will walk onto the field, and round 1 is likely to be targeted by Life for a Life, if the enemy has Blood 3 mages, which they should, because empowering in blood is cheap. Because it costs as if blood slaves are gems, but they're a lot easier to get. You'll have time for 1 buff, because it has casting time 150%. So if you're fighting a blood nation, your first buff on a supercombatant that you want to not die has to be Phoenix Pyre. Otherwise, he will be hit by Life for a Life and vaporized anytime after about turn 40-45, something like that. By the time, if they've had time to hit level 8 in a research, they may well have hit it in blood, and Life for a Life may well kill you. If they've had time to hit blood 7, and you come close, Leech's main downside compared to Life for a Life is that it has only range 30, but every blood mage can cast it. So if you're attacking if you're trying to raid with thugs, if you're trying to stop an army with supercombatants, whatever, blood nations are very, very good at shutting that down. Leech, specifically, is one reason why in the late game, raiding blood nations becomes incredibly hard, because you'll drop in a thug, and that thug will charge into 4 or 5 Blood 1 blood hunters who have just hunted up a whole bunch of slaves, so they all have slaves to use, excuse me, and they'll all cast Leech, and your thug will just die. Associated with that is the fact that because Leech is easy to cast, it only requires Blood 1, the AI loves to cast it off script. So Blood mages, especially if they don't have any cross paths, Blood 1 mages will absolutely cast Leech on you and will absolutely delete your thugs. Other spells. You do have Summon Ill Earth, which summons Ill Earth elementals. These are literally just Earth elementals, except they regenerate an extra 5%. So, not super impressive. Pain Transfer is an interesting little spell, but not super, super useful. Your blood mages can use this to save themselves from 1 or 2 hits, but at the cost of your blood slaves dying instead, which renders them useless because they need blood slaves to live, to do anything. So, Leeching Touch is just Leech, but only melee range, and of course it does drain life. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot. The other thing about Leech, this is drain life damage. So it regenerates the fatigue of the person who cast Leech. So they can cast it, it costs 100 fatigue, they hit you for 25 damage, they regenerate 2 fatigue per point of damage, which means they regenerate up to like 50 or even more fatigue. And then they cast it again, and especially if they're higher than Blood 1, they're using multiple slaves, it's entirely possible for a Blood Mage to be casting Leech perpetually, to never run out of fatigue, just run out of Blood Slaves, and eventually be forced to stop. The other spells that are very interesting, Blood has Rush of Strength at Blood 8, which is the same thing as I'm losing my mind. I've totally forgotten. Bloodlust, yes. It's the same thing as Bloodlust, but it affects everyone. It's interesting, but despite the fact that Earth has the strength buffs and prot buffs generally, Blood is actually the only path that has a battlefield-wide strength buff. Earth doesn't have this. Only Blood. And so this is battlefield-wide plus 4 strength. Easy peasy, nothing else to it. Blood also has Purify Blood, which is effectively Serpent's Blessing. It's battlefield-wide poison resistance. It even comes at the same level that Serpent's Blessing does. And Blood has Damage Reversal. This is probably the, as they say, the ultimate protection for a mage in battle. You cast this spell, for some reason this is listed as Dehydrate, but that's not accurate. And when you cast this spell, anyone who hurts you has to make a magic resistance check, and if they fail the check, they take the damage instead of you. So this is very good for thugs or supercombatants who have blood paths. In particular, I'm thinking of Dakini, which are a blood summon of the monkey nations. Dakini have Air 3, Blood 3, so they can Cloud Trapeze. So it's entirely possible to Cloud Trapeze a Dakini onto somebody with some gear. Cast air buffs, so Mist Form, Mirror Image, and Damage Reversal once you have Blood 9, which you probably are close to because Dakini require Blood 6 just to summon. In any case, once you cast those spells, not only do they have to pass several checks just to hurt you, if they succeed at hurting you, they then have to make a magic resistance roll or take the damage themselves instead, which is really sort of hilarious. But that's Blood 9. And then, at Blood 9, you also get the ultimate fuck your thug spells, Infernal Prison and Claws of Cocytus. These are just no save, go to hell, go directly to hell, do not pass go, do not collect $200, and if you cast this on a thug, that thug will vanish and be gone from the map and be uncontrollable. Every couple of turns, they'll be randomly attacked by either devils or frost fiends, imps, something like that, little demon units. If they survive many, many turns of this, they will randomly be spat out somewhere on the world map. So the thing about this is, A, there's a high possibility that they'll be spat out in, say, water and drown instantly, thus dying, or be spat out somewhere where they can't beat whatever army is there and die, accomplishing nothing because they're not scripted for it and they may not have the appropriate gear. And even if they do come back, this spell, for the cost of 2 blood slaves, removes them from play for a long time, like 10 to 15 turns long, a significant fraction of the game long. So it's pretty much as good as killing them, almost. Only downside, it requires a pretty rare mage to cast these spells. You need to have Blood 3 and an Elemental Cross Path. So a lot of nations just can't do it. Nations that can do this, Niflheim and associated nations can do this with Gigias or Skrati. Xibalba and Mictlan can do this one. I think Mictlan can do this one as well, actually. But Lanka can't do either of these. Bogarus, I think, can do some of them can do either with boosters. I forget if Bogarus has these cross paths. I don't think they have those cross paths, actually, or do they? Now I'm curious, I don't recall. But the point of what I'm saying is, a lot of Blood Nations struggle to cast these spells. So they are high level, they're difficult to get, but if you can get them, then they can be very impressive. Yeah, Starets can cast, actually, they have water randoms, they cannot, but they can cast Infernal Prison. So yeah, you can get one of these spells. Generally, you can't get both on any given nation because there's not a whole lot of nations that have both of these cross paths. In fact, I don't think there are any. But you can get one, and this is just the ultimate fuck your thug spell. So yeah, Blood is the anti-super combatant path, which is funny because it is also the super combatant path because you need blood to forge the items that send your people berserk without giving them automatic berserk and thus making them incapable of buffing themselves. But combat use is, in my opinion, a secondary use of blood. The primary uses of blood, in combat, the primary use of blood is to cast Sabbath Slave, Sabbath Master, and Reinvigoration. And then you use your cross paths to cast actual important spells. So if you're Lanka and you have blood mages with nature and air and death, You can use this to set up Sabbaths that cast Skelespam. You can use it to set up Sabbaths that cast big important nature and air buffs. So, you know, Wailing Winds, Winds of Death, Fog Warriors, Mass Flight, Mass Regeneration, Mass Protection, all of that stuff. Or you can, and you just use Reinvigoration to make them, you know, not die. That's the main combat use of Blood. Blood Heal, not super important. This would be a good supercombatant spell, except it requires you to be near your blood slaves, and any blood supercombatant is just going to run away from their own blood slaves. They're going to charge the enemy eventually, which makes it hard to kill blood slaves when they're all the way back across the map. But the main use of Blood is summons, and a lot of Blood summons, despite being altered and nerfed, are still quite effective, especially for the price. Starting from the bottom, Shadow Imps are cheap little scouts, and they're actually pretty good at it. They have 60 stealth, they have dark power, you can give them gems and have them skulk along with your armies. They only cost 4 blood slaves each, so they're super cheap, and they can do everything scouts do. They're good scouts. That's all they are. Fiery Imps, they're little fire damage chaff. If you have that and you want that, they're fine. They're not very powerful. You need strength buffs on them in order to get them to do any damage. Spine Devils, Spine Devils are pretty solid chaff, but you only get 1 per cast. And that's kind of the downside of a lot of these lower level summons. You only get 1 Spine Devil, you only get 1 Fiend of Darkness. Stat-wise, Demon Troops are really good. Like, look at Fiends of Darkness, and Spine Devils and all that stuff. The stats on these guys are actually pretty amazing. They have high hit points, they have high stats, they tend to have some kind of other special abilities. They have poison on their claws. Fiends of Darkness have dark power and stealth and fly. Spine Devils have the poison barbs effect, so people who attack them with short weapons will get poisoned. They're good. They have high magic resistance, they have 30 morale, so they don't rout. All of that is very solid. But you only get 1 at a time, and your low-level blood mages are usually busy blood hunting in order to build up your massive blood economy. So you won't be using these too much. Bind Devil is probably the first one that I would say is really worth considering using a lot of. And that's because Devils have high hit points, they have good stats, including high strength, and they have 2 attacks. Their Trident attack does very good damage, and is length 3. And their Barbed Tail attack is magical, and has paralyzing poison, which does fatigue damage. They also have a heat aura, so they can set people on fire. So Devils are extremely solid troops. Some people are down on Devils because, once again, you only get 1 of them per mage turn, and they require a fairly potent cross path. But if you have that ability, if you are, for example, Late Age Marignon, or Bogarus, or something, then Devils are very good. Frost Fiends, likewise, can be quite solid, because they have this Frost Blast, which is an armor-piercing cold attack. Honestly, cold resistance is a lot less common than fire resistance or shock resistance, and so Frost Fiends can do some work with that. They are a little bit fragile, because they have only protection 5, but once again, 25 hit points. Good stats. They also have this Ice Rod, which is a magic melee weapon, so that's not bad, and their defense skill is very high, so if they're caught in melee, they can kind of account for themselves. They really like prop buffs. So if you have Stone Skin in particular, Stone Skin reduces their cold resist, but it reduces it to 20, so who cares? And it will kick their natural protection up to 15, which makes them extremely tough. At that point, they're actually infantry shock troops with a secondary ranged attack. Crossbreeding is a spell that you cast when you want chaff. Crossbreeding generates random monsters. Some of them are powerful, most of them are garbage, but all of them are free of upkeep and cheap. They cost less than 1 blood slave apiece. So if you need, like, patrol chaff, this is essentially a superior pack of wolves. If you need just something to stand in front of your armies and absorb arrows for a little while, this is a perfectly fine spell. A good spell, even. This is the kind of spell that Lanka loves. It's blood and nature cross paths. Blood Feast is a good spell for thugs. In particular, it removes afflictions, and so it's one of those spells that helps you keep old blood mages alive, and helps keep thugs from becoming ineffective, or pretender gods with blood from becoming ineffective due to afflictions gathered through expansion. Very solid. Serpent Fiends are bad. Don't bother summoning Serpent Fiends. They only have 1 attack, they have lower hit points than most demons. They actually have morale. They do not have 30 morale like a lot of demons do, which is kind of odd. Their weapon is very poisonous, but it doesn't counteract their negatives. Storm Demons, however. Storm Demons are amazing. They cost 10 blood slaves, which is the equivalent of like 3 or 4 gems. I would absolutely pay 4 gems for this guy. Naturally ethereal, flying, he resists shock, he has storm power. His lightning attack has a range of 40, 10 ammunition, and it does damage, armor negating damage, might I add, equal to his strength. And he's a demon, so you can cast Bloodlust on him, which makes his strength 16. So the lightning attack is incredibly powerful. On top of that, he also has a Thunder Fist attack, which does bludgeoning lightning damage plus a 10 damage armor negating shock. Bludgeoning magic damage, I'm sorry, plus the shock damage in melee. So in melee, Storm Demons are still powerful, especially if, once again, you can buff their prot. If you can buff their natural protection a little bit, they're ethereal. They will sit there punching people to death all day in melee. Beyond that, these spells you don't really see too much. Blood Fecundity is only useful if you haven't already taken Growth 3, and Reign of Toads is, it's not super anonymous because not a lot of nations can cast it, and it doesn't help you all that much. It sometimes causes diseases, and it causes unrest on an enemy province, but why waste the turn is how I feel. Demon Knights got a huge nerf. They actually doubled in price in this last patch, and I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether they're still worth it. They're still powerful units, don't get me wrong. They're very high stat, very high protection, morale 30 knights, with fear. So they're solid. It's just that they're kind of expensive now. Like, the equivalent cost is about 5 or maybe 6 gems. And that's a lot for a single unit. I'm not sure that I would spend a lot of time summoning them at this point. But it's worth thinking about, I suppose. If you're Xibalba, Xibalba can summon Demon Knights, and they can add a much-needed little bit of punch to your armies. The other major summons are, of course, the supercombatant chassis, the individual, unique blood summons that you get at higher levels. And this is where the distinction between the summons in general, but especially the summons, are where the differences between the generic blood spells and the different kinds of national spells really come into focus. The generic blood spells give you the Ice Devils, Archdevils, Heliophagi, and Demon Lords. The important ones here, the important usage of these are either supercombatant chassis or for path access. So the Demon Lords each give you different path access. Pazuzu gives you air and death. Belphegor gives you fire and earth. Belial gives you fire and nature. Buer gives you fire and death. Geryon gives you death and nature. And Ashmedai gives you fire and astral. Ashmedai can break you into summoning horrors, or sending horrors, and he can also cast astral corruption with the proper boosters. Geryon, I don't think Geryon's super impressive. Buer can break you into the high-level fire spells. He can forge fire boosters, and he can cast Eternal Pyre if you haven't already done that by the time you hit Blood 9. Belial, likewise. Belphegor can give you that Fire-Earth crosspath, which can be kind of handy for forging, I suppose. He also generates 3 blood slaves per turn, which is kind of cool. He will never, might I say, pay himself back, but he's, sort of hilarious. They all have downsides. They're all heretics, I believe, or something. Most of them are heretics. Buer, actually, it looks like, is not a heretic. He casts heat from hell in every battle he's in. They all have lots of special qualities. They're all very unique. Geryon actually lowers your fortune, so he brings bad events. Ashmedai gives you unrest and summons succubi. Belial increases unrest and is a negative bringer of misfortune. Belphegor generates blood slaves and is a heretic. And Pazuzu is a reaper, so Pazuzu literally plagues your provinces and has a ton of fear. Also, I believe... I'm not sure. I believe when Pazuzu enters play, there's a number of negative events that can be triggered. But so in general, and some of them summon units that are kind of cool, and they have all kinds of cool qualities. I don't honestly summon them very much. They cost a lot of slaves, and you need a very high-level caster to get them. The Heliophagi are easy to get. The Heliophagi give you fire or death, basically. If you don't have death or you don't have fire, it is worth summoning Heliophagi to get that. They're also very usable supercombatant chassis, and of course if they die you can simply resummon them, so it's not a big deal. In terms of the other supercombatants, Ice Devils are not very good supercombatants. They give you water, which you actually already need to summon them. So if you don't have water, you can't really get these guys. These are kind of the Niflheim special. The nicest one of them is Gop here, because Gop starts with a Hell Sword, which is a life-draining weapon, so he can be an extremely effective thug with very minimal equipment. The others, not super impressive. They don't have a whole lot of different paths, mainly just water. You do get Astral from Sibije, and you get, Astral from Bifrons, and you get Death from Bune, but those shouldn't be too impressive for the nations that can summon Ice Devils. The Niflheim line already has Death, already has Astral, already has Water. So Ice Devils don't give you much for way of path access. They just give you some nice thug chassis, basically. At Blood 9, then, you get the mass troop summon spells as well, and all of these are about the same. They summon a large number of the appropriate unit at a discount. So Infernal Forces gives you 7 Devils and Imps. Infernal Tempest gives you 7 Storm Demons, Forces of Ice gives you 8 Frost Fiends, and Infernal Crusade gives you 10 Demon Knights. Infernal Crusade is literally a 3-fold discount. If you want Demon Knights, spamming Infernal Crusade is definitely worth it. Forces of Ice, Infernal Tempest, all of that stuff, that's also very, very good. So all these summons, these high-level summons are quite powerful. They are expensive, but that you can amass a literal army of demons very quickly by casting them if you have the casters that can do so. In particular, like Infernal Tempest, 7+ Storm Demons, if you can boost your blood level, which once again you can do pretty easily because you can forge a bunch of blood boosters and empower and get somebody up to like blood 7 or 8. And then this spell scales. And so you can be summoning 9 or 10 Storm Demons per casting. That's powerful. Storm Demons are very, very good. Infernal Crusade is also by far the most efficient way to get Demon Knights, and Demon Knights are solid. You just have to have some way to get them effectively. Infernal Forces, it's okay. It's not bad. Forces of Ice, not bad. Once again, if you want ranged AP damage, Forces of Ice is a good way to get it. In terms of summons, though, the scariest part about Blood is their globals. Blood has a number of globals. Blood has Blood Vortex. They have the Looming Hell. Oh yeah, they have Forces of Darkness, which summons 14 Fiends of Darkness. If you have easy access to the Darkness spell through high death magic or by summoning Mandiha or something, Fiends of Darkness can be very powerful because of their dark power. But as I was saying, Blood Vortex, the Looming Hell, and what was the other one? I thought there was another global. Maybe I'm crazy. I might be crazy. Astral Corruption, that's right. Those are the 3 Blood Globals. The thing about Blood Globals is you can cast them with 1,000,000 Blood Slaves and make them undispellable. Blood Slaves do, since the last patch, count as half a gem for the purpose of calculating dispel overcasts, but that doesn't really matter. Like, if I have Astral Corruption, any mage that can cast Astral Corruption is capable of spending 600 Blood Slaves on casting it. And if I'm casting Astral Corruption, I am going to spend 600 Blood Slaves on casting it, which means that you would have to put 300 gems. Oh, I'm sorry, it wouldn't be 300 gems. The overcast would be 433. So you would have to put, that would be 217 effectively. You would have to put, that many gems into a Dispel in order to cast it. You have to put over 200 Astral Pearls into a Dispel to get rid of Astral Corruption. Ain't nobody gonna do that. Not unless you have Arcane Nexus up. So once I cast Astral Corruption, it's up. It's just there. It's never coming down unless another Blood Nation replaces it with an even more powerfully cast Blood Global. Blood Vortex generates Blood Slaves for you every turn. It's not quite as impressive as Astral Corruption, but it's like, depending on where you cast it and the turmoil scales and all that, it's something like 30 or 40 Blood Slaves per turn. This description is a lie, by the way. What this actually does is generate random events all across the world that lower population in random provinces, and then give you Blood Slaves based on that, plus a small base number. It doesn't have anything to do with proximity to the Blood Vortex, as far as I can tell. And the Looming Hell, it's not honestly super powerful. It just generates effectively seduction or assassination attempts on all kinds of enemy commanders. It's not assassination, it's seduction attempts, essentially. But Blood Nations can just use it to fill a slot, to push somebody else's global off the board and make it, just occupy a slot with something that doesn't really help anybody else and may occasionally help them a little bit. The last of the important summons for blood, we have Father Ill-Earth, which summons Pedocion. Pedocion is one of the best supercombatant chassis in the game, because he has native regeneration 15% plus fear, and his hit points are really high. So Pedocion, you can gear him up, and he becomes almost impossible to stop. Plus he has morale 30, and pretty high base magic resistance. If you can summon him, you already have high earth, because he requires earth 4 in order to cast. So if you can do that, then you can afford to load him up with like a lead shield. Hopefully you can get him an amulet of anti-magic, all that stuff. You've seen me use Pedocion in the first Accidental Ascension game. He's very, very hard to kill. And of course, he costs 105 blood slaves, so you can just re-summon him if he dies. It's not a big problem. And Ritual of 5 Gates. Ritual of 5 Gates costs 39 slaves. It gives you one of each type of devil, of demon. It's kind of weird. It's hard to use effectively because it means that you have to kind of split all those demons up into the appropriate places. But on the other hand, it's a highly efficient way of getting these guys. You know, they cost like 7 and change blood slaves each if you summon them this way, which is a very significant discount on Demon Knights, pretty decent discount on Storm Demons, about the same for Devils and Frost Fiends, and actually more expensive for Fiends of Darkness, which is funny. But overall, it averages out to an increase, to a decrease in price, an increase in usability. Still, I wouldn't cast it all that much. What else is really good here? Infernal Disease is good. It generates a fairly powerful assassination on an enemy commander in the province where you target it, but it requires a Blood 5 mage, a Blood 5 mage. So if you have a bunch of Blood 5 mages sitting around, you can spam disease demons on enemy armies in order to cripple them, which I have done before myself. Even if the disease demon doesn't kill them, it's very likely to disease them because it spreads plague around it, and both of its attacks cause disease when they hit. So, yeah, even if you don't actually kill the enemy commander outright, you're going to disease them, and unless they have some way to remove or ignore disease, they're going to die eventually, no matter what. So, disease demons, very powerful. The downside is just that they require a real high-level blood mage who might rather be doing something else. Those are all the basic, generic blood spells that are really important. There's lots of other ones. Awaken Dark Vines. Dark Vines are very meaty kind of chaff units. You can give them regeneration and they become very tough. Rejuvenate makes you younger. If you have old blood mages, you can use this to keep them alive longer. Plague of Locusts lowers enemy dominion where you target it. It's just really expensive, so I wouldn't necessarily use it. The various horror spells can be quite powerful and in fact can kind of form an end game. If you have Blood Astral at high levels, you can spam horrors onto enemy provinces in order to remove them from enemy control. It's a remote attack with quite a long range, and horrors are very, very hard for province defense to kill, so they will almost always succeed and leave those provinces uncontrolled, which of course removes their income and gems and all that from the enemy. So it's an excellent way to cripple an enemy during a war. You just, once again, have to have some high-level mages and a lot of slaves available, and basically in order to do this, you have to be like Abyssia or Bogorus. Sometimes the Niflheim line nations can do it as well, but it's difficult. Oh, have I talked about Astral Corruption? Astral Corruption is the worst global in the game. Astral Corruption causes every piece of magic that isn't blood to be attacked by horrors. Like, literally every time they do anything, there is a chance that they will be attacked by horrors. If Astral Corruption is up, you're either a blood nation or you're going to die, because it makes your mages almost useless outside of combat, or rather, it means there's a risk. If you want a mage to be forging powerful items, or casting globals, or summoning, or any of that, you have to equip them with quite powerful bodyguards and anti-horror precautions, because otherwise they'll be assassinated. Can I also note, the kind of horror that appears is random from Astral Corruption. It could be just a normal-ass, like, lesser horror that's fairly easy to beat. It could be Kurgi, the Slave to Unreason, or one of the other Doom horrors, who will devour you and all of your bodyguards whole. And the chance, I believe, of a higher-level horror appearing goes up as what you're doing becomes more powerful. So if you're forging a 40-gem item, you damn right a powerful horror is going to show up, probably. If you're forging a 5-gem item, you may well get away scot-free. In any case, this video is actually running a little bit long, but so this is all the generic blood stuff. I think I'm going to have to do a follow-up talking about the national blood stuff, because as I said, there's some really, really important national blood magic that I haven't gotten to talk about yet. Early age Lanka's national blood summons, super, super important. The Shibalban and Mictlan national blood summons, super, super important. And of course, the Niflheim line has a couple of national spells. In fact, I think it's only one. Yeah, it's only Illwinter, but that is important to their strategy. So I'll talk about those in a follow-up video. This is especially timely because I'm about to go into a game playing as Lanka. And so I'll be talking, it'll be very interesting to me to gather my thoughts and talk about Lankan's strategy in regards to their national spells in particular. But in any case, I'll see you next time. Hopefully this has been somewhat useful. Thank you once again to Pendragon9123 for his support, and stay tuned.